I'm Beck and welcome to my February wrap up. I read 6 books and I put down 2 books during the month of February, so that is a decent reading month for me. Ideally, I'd like to get to 7 or 8 books read during the month, but technically if I count them all together, there's 8 books here. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about them. However, the first book on this list, I finished it mostly during January and then I just finished the ending during February, and that is Pucking Around. This one starts out with One More Night or One Last Night. It's a novella that sets up the premise for Pucking Around, and you can read Pucking Around without it, but personally if you want more spicy smutty story and decent character work, then sure, read the novella as well. Thankfully, it's included in the actual audiobook. I'm not sure about the physical book, so it's included as a preamble before you start the actual book. But Pucking Around sets up Rachel and Jake, and they have a amazing one-night stand. They feel this real strong emotional connection, but they don't get each other's real names. She knows that he's a professional and he knows that she is high up in her field, but they don't really know much about each other beyond that. And then they go back to their respective lives afterward, and they can't stop thinking about that night they had together. Now, Rachel has just been offered this job out of the blue because she didn't think it was going to be a possibility. And the job is her as a physio, a doctor, going to oversee this professional hockey team and ensure they maintain and take care of their bodies when they're injured and that kind of thing. So she goes off to do that and does not realize that Jake is one of the star hockey players on this team, and they rekindle their romance that way. While she's with Jake, she also ends up being with one of the other guys, Caleb. It turns into a poly situation. There is another guy added in as well, and Jake and Caleb are longtime best friends, so there is a bi-awakening for Jake as well. And I found that the story was driven enough by character for me to be invested in it, even though the audiobook was over 20 hours long, which seems utterly ridiculous for a romance book. I would expect that from a fantasy book, for example. But this one was fun, it was spicy and sexy, and honestly I just had a great time with it. I ended up giving it 4 stars. It is definitely a vehicle for smut, so if you are interested, then go ahead and read it. I at this point want to continue but don't feel the need to continue yet, so that will be like further along on my radar, probably for the end half of the year or something. Maybe if that, I'll continue it then, but I don't really feel a fire to continue it. It concluded in a way that I'm happy with, so 4 stars and I moved on. Then I read My Roommate is a Vampire, which is a popular romance going around on TikTok at the moment, and it's about a girl named Cassie. She's an artist and she's pretty much broke. For her job, she teaches at the local library and she runs different art sessions for the kids, and aside from that, she's like, I need somewhere to live because she can't really afford somewhere. And when she sees this ad on Craigslist by Frederick, she thinks it's a scam, goes along, realizes that it's not a scam, and she ends up moving in with him. And Frederick turns out to be a vampire, and for the past 100 years he has been asleep, so he's got no understanding of the modern world whatsoever. So him renting out one of his rooms is kind of his way of asking for help because he wants access to the modern world and trying to learn it, and so he does that through getting to know Cassie better. As a premise, it's pretty cute, and she does find out that he's a vampire in the first quarter of the book, so I like that the gloves were off basically from the beginning. And I also enjoyed the way that this story went along in terms of the plot. I didn't really question things. I wasn't really thrown by too much in the narrative. It all kind of seemed to roll on and be understandable, but at the same time there was some chemistry between the characters that I questioned, particularly around consent. Frederick was great with consent, asking Cassie everything, and then Cassie told him to wait instead of explaining something to him, and then just went ahead and did it when he'd made her pause. So that made me a little bit uncomfortable. I was like, he's extending the courtesy, why don't you extend the courtesy as well? And the writing was humorous in a sense. There was a time when Frederick was trying to learn Instagram and was making out this comment on one of Cassie's friends' posts, and he's like, I do not want to make matters worse with my comment on breakfast photography. So it had its own humor and I liked it, but overall it was just kind of forgettable. Combine that with the consent scene and I was like, yeah, I could leave this book. I ended up finishing it anyway. I gave it 2.5 stars, and it just is what it is. It's not one that I'm super enjoyed or chuffed about. It's one that I may not recommend, honestly, because it seemed like a little bit of a waste of time. It's kind of like if you see a dessert in the window of a shop and then you eat it and it looks better than it actually tastes. That's how I felt about this book. So it was fine, and then I moved on and it was done with. And then we get on to my first DNF, or did not finish, of the month, and I got 140 pages into the song Rising by Samantha Shannon and ended up putting it down. And I had temporarily put this down last year and I thought it was just my mood at the time, but in picking this up again, it's an urban fantasy about a rebellion and clairvoyance. So if you are clairvoyant, which means you have a kind of magic connected to ghosts and the spiritual realm, if you've got that magic, you are automatically targeted by Scion London, and therefore you kind of have to become a criminal to survive. And we follow Paige Mahoney, who is our main character, and at the beginning of the book she gets taken by the night police to this secret camp, and at this camp she runs into these Rephites who are like otherworldly beings, and there is a rebellion brewing, and now she's linked to the city of Scion and she's trying to incite rebellion there too. So I liked the intent of the story, but I just didn't like the packaging. I was not connecting to the writing style. I really struggled with emotional attachment, and I don't know why. I read this book ages ago when it was first released and I loved it. Although actually I love the series, but this was my least favorite of the series. So it kind of makes sense that in my reread I've fallen down on this one because I was just not loving it that much. And it was a shame it took me over 100 pages to realize that, because I feel like I wasted time. It was fine the first time through, but I feel like there was just something missing and I couldn't put my finger on it. So I'm glad I put this down, because as soon as I did, I got my momentum back and my interest back in reading. So clearly it was the right thing to do, like cutting my losses, but I'm sad that as a female fantasy author, I could not get into Samantha Shannon again. So maybe her writing style is just not for me. I've had hits and misses with her other work as well, so I'm just going to chalk it up to her style and go, maybe it's not for me at all. Then I tried out another audiobook and it was marketed as romantasy, but I really don't feel like it should technically be romantasy. I think it was just thrown into that category because that category seems to be bloated at the moment with so many releases. It's like the hot new buzzword to get people to buy books. But this was called Swordcrossed and I really enjoyed it. And it's mostly a period romance with a backdrop of fantasy, but it's only fantasy to give modern liberties to that period setting. And I can get behind that, so I enjoyed it. We follow our main character Matanesh J, or Matty, and he is the next in line to take over his house and his house's business. However, his house has a secret, and that is they're financially struggling and have been for a while. And so they're trying to make ends meet up until this arranged wedding with Matty and this other woman, because her family is a bit more well off, and having them as a actual connection to the family and a business connection as well is going to boost Matty's family's business and their ability to stay afloat financially. And then enter Luca Pierre, who is a traveling swordsman, and he's a con artist as well. He has a run-in with Matty at the beginning of the book and cons Matty, and then later on Matty uses his remaining gold to try and find a swordsman to help defend him at his wedding, because at this wedding, if someone disagrees with the marriage union, they can stand up and challenge the groom to a sword duel, and Matty can't fight with a sword, so he's like, I need someone to defend my honor, basically. And that's what he hires Luca for. He realizes that Luca conned him at the beginning, so they have a bit of a rocky start, and I liked that that led to tension because both of them are clearly attracted to each other, but they're trying to ignore it because they're annoyed at each other. So I really like how that started to blossom. And I also, at the beginning of this book, was quite concerned about the arranged marriage versus the relationship that Matty was pursuing with Luca, because I thought, oh, is it going to have cheating by omission or lying by omission in it? Because I don't want him to betray the woman that he's going to marry, but she's not romantically interested in him in the slightest. And she also asks him at the beginning of the book, like, have you got any romantic interest in anyone? At the time though, he doesn't have interest in Luca because he hasn't met him properly yet, so he says no. So I like that it was only a business arrangement between Sophia and Matty, the bride-to-be. What I did really like about this book was the intimacy. It felt very tender and vulnerable at times, and I really liked the connection that was building between Matty and Luca. What kind of let me down a bit was the descriptions of the plot, because it felt like it was very much taking a back seat, and I love a character-led story, so I was absolutely adoring that part. So the characters and the relationships and the intimacy would probably be a 4 stars, but the plot to undercut and support all of that would be like a 3 stars. So overall, even though I enjoyed the ending, there was, a culmination and then a twist on the culmination and then the ending happened. I like it when stories get a bit creative like that. I liked that overall story, but I just wish it was a little bit stronger in the foundations of the plot, because sometimes things were mentioned in dialogue and I thought, oh, I don't understand that reference. Has this been foreshadowed or mentioned before? And it hadn't been. It was really just thrown in there to confuse the reader, and then later on it was explained, and I don't really gel with that kind of style. So that's why I ended up giving a 3.5 stars to this book, but I still really enjoyed myself and I would recommend this book because it was a lot of fun. Then I read from one of my favorite authors of all time, and that is Robin Hobb. So I read Royal Assassin, and this one follows Fitz, and he is the bastard son to Prince Chivalry. However, because he's got royal blood, it puts him in a questionable position because he's technically in line for the throne, but they don't want him to have that power over the throne. So they keep him very close and train him up in their own ways. And so he's got a very strong sense of duty to the current king. However, Fitz is also becoming a teenager and he wants to live his own life as well. So this book really explores the relationships that Fitz has with those beautiful side characters that I feel are very real to me. And it really segments his duty and his personal life because it forces him to choose sometimes between both. Sometimes they align, most often they don't. And he's also keeping secrets as well that he doesn't really have anyone to confide in about. So I loved that it's exploring that chosen one trope, but it's making him feel very isolated, and it's like the trauma of the chosen one, because I don't really see that very much. I always see the hero getting accolades, but in this it's very much behind the curtain. I did write a quote down from Fitz's love interest, Molly, and I love Molly. She's so fiery and charismatic and driven. And she says, "In deciding to keep things from me, you make choices for me." And I just love how she calls him out. It's so good. She really dangles the truth in front of him too, in the sense that, well, why aren't you choosing me and your love for me if you want to marry me, instead of having to choose between supporting your duty to the king and queen in waiting? Why would you do that to me when you love me? So it was such an emotionally raw book, and it was so intense in such a good way. And I put this off for like a year because I started it, got 180 pages into it or something, and then I've come back because I'm finally in the right mood to read it, and it hit so hard and so good, and I'm giving it a 5 stars, as you would expect. But we went from a 5 stars to a did not finish, so I DNF'd The Promise of Blood, which is another epic fantasy, but I feel like this focused more on the intent and the plot rather than the characters, because that was really where it fell down for me personally, and the style of how it was telling the narrative was not for me. So it was about this guy who is a personal investigator. He used to be part of the police force in this fantasy world, and he gets called to the king's room at midnight, and he catches a wagon there, gets off the wagon, sees a dead body, walks into the chamber and realizes that there is a current coup against the current king. And he's like, well, why did you drag me into this, basically? But it doesn't just follow him, it follows like a captain of the guard and the captain of the guard's son, and then I think somebody else as well who's a handmaiden, and she's escaping the castle while it's being ransacked and manages to take the royal son, like the prince, with her, who's just a young boy. So she's technically preserved the royal line, even though the king has been in gambling debt and destroying his kingdom slowly. So it's like an uprising of the people as a rebellion against power, because they want their control back of their lives. They don't want to be in debt and indebted to a king anymore, like the one that's currently ruling. So there is a whole bunch going on in terms of the politics and the different moving characters in here, but it just felt like it was missing a spark for me. The magic was cool, but it wasn't enough to solely keep me reading. So the series is called the Powder Mage series, and that's because characters in this world can ingest or snort or inhale gunpowder and then redirect its force. So there were some very cool scenes in here at the beginning where characters are redirecting bullets. That was cool, and there was also different types of magic user. That meant the powder mages were at the top, and then there were also privileged and knacked. So if you were knacked, I think you were born with a particular magic, but it was a lower grade. And then privileged was another kind of magic user altogether. I think it was more elemental. So there were some cool things happening, but it never really actively explored the magic. It kind of just sprinkled characters in who could use it here and there, and it focused more so on the fighting and the blood and the politics, and none of that I was interested in. So unfortunately, I ended up putting it down at 28%, and I suspected I might end up putting it down when I started it because the writing wasn't quite up to what I'm used to and what I'm interested in, but I gave it a go and I thought, I could continue reading this. But then I decided to put it down because I didn't want to waste my time. It would probably be a maximum 3-star read anyway, so I just cut my losses. And then instead of a reread to get a 5 stars, I actually found a new to me 5-star book, which I'm so happy about. And that is Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. And this one follows Alexis Montgomery, and she is from a very renowned family of doctors. And one night she is on the road back from a funeral and she's passing through this really small town about 2 or 3 hours outside of where she lives, and her car breaks down and someone pulls over and helps her and says, you're not really going to get anywhere at this time of night. Like, there's a pub around the corner and it's the only thing open to get a meal at. So that's where she ends up going. And lo and behold, the guy who fixed her car is there because that's where everyone in the town hangs out because there's nowhere else really to go. And his name is Daniel, and they really connect and hit it off. And she ends up sleeping with him that night and goes, I never do this, and has a bit of a mini freak out about it. But afterwards she can't stop thinking about him and he can't stop thinking about her. And she ends up making trips back and forth to the town and just reconnecting and realizing how much she is into this relationship, even though she's not quite calling it a relationship. And she also doesn't want to commit because she's worried that her family will drastically judge and impact Daniel as well, but Daniel doesn't really know that about her. So she's also leaving an abusive relationship too, and so that's layered into the story in terms of her going to therapy and understanding how to navigate things. And I really liked that this was actually responsible for communications with its key characters. I did say that she was a bit withheld at the beginning, and I think that's just because it's a reflection of how she came out of her previous relationship rather than anything the author was doing to withhold the story. So it felt very genuine in the narrative, and I stayed up until midnight to finish this book. I cried several times throughout the story, and it just felt very grounded to me, and I loved the connection. I loved the realistic reactions, and I also hated the right characters as well because they were set up to be so hateable. So it was such a good book, and even though it said it was an age gap romance, there's like 9 to 10 years between Alexis and Daniel, and that was brought up at the beginning, but neither of them really had an issue with it, and that wasn't the problem anyway. It was the class difference because Daniel's from this small country town and he's technically the mayor of this town, but they all just kind of get on with it because they don't have a lot of resources, so they band together as a found family whole community and ensure everyone has what they need. And Annie has never seen that before because she's always had people to do her work for her in terms of housework and that kind of thing. She's never been handy. She's always been a workaholic, and she's had the pressure on her to not let go of her family's legacy. So there's that coming up against tradition and friendship and values of this community town. So she applies her knowledge to this town and helps save lives there because she's a doctor. And so you see that people actually genuinely appreciate her there, whereas in her Montgomery world, no one really sees her. So it's just such a good book in the sense of understanding who you are and being recognized for who you are. And I just love that so much. So of course it got a 5 stars. And I am of course keen to continue reading Abby Jimenez because if I started out her books on a 5 stars, then I have such high hopes for the rest of them. And then the last book that I managed to finish in February was one that I thought I would like quite a lot because it's a dark academia story with morally grey characters, but it didn't quite hit how I was hoping, and that is An Academy for Liars. And this one follows Lennon. At the beginning of the book, she is about to enter her engagement party, but she flees from that in the middle of the night because she realizes that she's not happy with her life at all and her partner's not been very good to her. She sees him cheating with this person that she suspected he was cheating on her with, and so she's like, okay, I'm done, and just takes his Porsche and drives off into the night. And when she's out of the car intending to take a whole bunch of pills, she walks past a phone booth and it rings, and for some reason she answers, and it's this school called Drayton, and they are calling her to say that she's been admitted for an entrance exam. So without really knowing what she's going to do with the rest of her life, she accepts and goes to the exam. Obviously she gets in, otherwise there wouldn't be a book, and it's about her navigating this new world with this dark magic and understanding this mind control magic and power that she's got. And so while there were really creepy moments in here, which I mentioned in my currently reading videos as I was going through this book during February, so I'll link my playlist below if you want to check those out, but it had different moments that peaked throughout the story, but I found that I was again not connecting to the writing style, and that's because It felt like when this character was experiencing something, it got to the intensity of the moment and then it would like emotionally draw back. And I just did not feel that connection. It felt like a huge disconnect when it could have been something that I was made more invested in the character, for example. It also just felt like the side characters in this book were thrown in whenever they were convenient, so I didn't really form any connection to them. And I know that you're not supposed to necessarily love all of the characters in A Dark Academia because they're not good people, they're morally grey, but you can still kind of understand or empathize with different parts of them if they are written well, whereas this didn't feel like it was written as deeply as it could have been. I wrote in my notes and I said, this book is a constant flex for how mysterious it can be without giving the reader answers. And that comment just reinforces the lack of intimacy I felt with this story. It also tended to throw blood and viscera in when it felt like it was unnecessary. And I think that's because it seemed like that's what was expected of this particular genre. So that's what it would throw in. And I just did not care, honestly. So I ended up getting to the end of this because I forced myself to push through it, because I was like, I need to finish this before I can start the third book in the Robin Hobb Farseer series. And I finished this and now I've started that book. So I finished it in time for February, which I'm proud of myself for. But in terms of the rating of it, I'm like, why did I continue a book that was a 2.5 stars? But here we are and I did it. So that is the end of February's reading. I'm hoping that in March I read some more fantastic books, because at least I found one 5-star in Part of Your World. So I haven't lost all hope. If you've got any recommendations of books that you loved during February, please let me know down below in the comments. I'll come chat to you down below. Like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.